The other day, I was thinking about, in reviewing some anthropological literature, I thought about the word anthropocentrism, which has been used. And anthropocentrism, as weird a term as it is essentially a combination of two words, anthropo or anthros meaning man or human being, and centrism obviously at the center. So anthropocentrism is essentially the study or the focus of anything you want to think about, putting human beings at the center as if they were the most important thing that you were actually essentially looking at. And so I asked myself, is this something that actually appears in film? Is there anthropocentrism in film? And I thought, yeah, most films are really about people. Most films are really about stories of different kinds, human concerns. And I just felt that when I really thought about it, almost all film narrative is anthropocentric. Almost all film narrative is about human beings. In fact, then I pulled back and I started thinking about the idea of narrative. What in fact is narrative, and all of our reading, of course, has always showed us that narrative is a sequence of events. Beginning, middle, and an end, consequences, a change of conditions along the way, different events, yeah. But in film, because it's so anthropocentric, what we end up with is the idea that film narrative is really not a narrative about anything other than narratives about people, narratives about human affairs. And I started wondering whether there wasn't a different way of bringing narratives, different changes of state, events, etc., to the world through film. And then before I even got to that point, I realized that there's a kind of mafia-like monopoly, the mafia of anthropocentric cinema. And that's what I thought I could talk about today in terms of what I feel is a very limiting practice to the medium of film. So that if we say that anthropocentrism is to place human affairs at the center, and as a practice in film takes the idea of narrative and distorts it, narrows it down to the sense that it's just about story, it's about people, instead of the larger sense of a sequence of events accounting for some change or condition, then I think that we should think about how we could imagine some possible uses of film, or possible stories, possible narratives that are not anthropocentric, that are not necessarily about people in some way. Now, I'll be the first to say, like anybody else, that there's nothing wrong with events about people, but why is that the only kind of event that films normally explore? I mean, by limiting the idea of narrative to just one kind of narrative, narratives about people, film has come to represent really what we could call a kind of tradition, rather than a broad field of possible inquiry of all kinds of state changes. And I think that larger idea of narrative brings us to the full power of what a medium can bring, especially film. Now, not everything has to be broadly seen. I mean, there's lots of things in the world that exist because they were designed for the specific use to which we find them today. Wallpaper, air conditioners, water faucets, pens and pencils. I mean, I think these and lots of other objects are tools that are used in correctly narrow accordance with the way that they were originally designed and the use for which they were intended. But film is not manufactured with such a kind of narrow view that it has to be only about people. I mean, its frame isn't there just to capture human bodies or facial expressions. Film is a broad tool, it's a general tool, it's a general system designed to capture anything that's physically visible. And so by definition, it could capture any kind of narrative. And most of us focus the majority of our visual, optical, retinal energy in our eyes on things in the world, not just on people. Yet narrative film has this constant habit of flattening everything down to a kind of dead filler. All kinds of objects are thrown into the background like a silent prop over which the behaviors and the words of people are going to be carefully placed and carefully arranged. And that's narrative in film. You almost don't need anything else. Many films are about one or two people talking and hardly any objects at all. Now, in that narrow industrial view of film narrative, really no object no matter how marvelous or how amazing it is, can be spared its tragic fate inside the film frame. Almost any object is reduced to little more than an extra, as if it were just another unnamed person in the film's cast of characters. And the most obvious and poignant cases of this reduction come from the way that film in general uses architecture and architectural objects and structures and edifices and all kinds of the beautiful things that architecture gives us and gives us to our world. A lot of these in film are used as mere props to just sort of set the mood. The Eiffel Tower, for example, I mean, that's always present in many films. It's always distant, almost always distant anyway. You can see it from the windows of people in films that are supposed to be set in Paris. There's all kinds of uses of it, and some are more creative than others. But as soon as the Eiffel Tower is set up as a kind of stamp to prove to you as the viewer that we're really looking at a story about Paris, the Eiffel Tower is taken away. It's really used in a very limited way. Or the former towers of the World Trade Center, in the case of films based in New York. Same idea. They appear and disappear at whim. But this, I think, film tradition of using people-based narratives that make architecture or any object become a mute background drop and a prop back there. This doesn't have to be the only fate for architecture. It doesn't have to be the only fate for any kind of object. Every object has a history. And thinking about how that history has become what it is today, and how objects have become evolved, even architectural objects, through that history, through that past, and then taking all those ideas that nobody talks about in film and try to incorporate them into a film. I mean, I think that's the idea that I'm putting forward here, with very little cost to the idea of being an imaginative filmmaker. I mean, if writers and film directors thought philosophically, the history of an object could actually help promote a film storyline. I mean, one possible example might be even in a very traditional genre like romance, where maybe like an initial establishing shot, say in Paris, of course, to bring the viewer to the Eiffel Tower at the center with maybe slow zoom or unusual shots even that bring its beauty closer to us. All this can accompany the voiceover, say, of a narrator, maybe one of the film's characters, who at that moment might be sharing a memory that uses the tower's own architectural history as an analogy with the plot of the film. And he might bring both his personal memory and that tower's history together, making the object have a kind of relevance, not just a mute and silent presence. And maybe in a narration he might say something like, when the design of the Eiffel Tower first came up in 1889, Paris was shocked and opinion was divided as to the place of such an object in a city known for its traditional beauty. But its designer, Gustave Eiffel, who was himself both very French and very much an engineer, must have been thinking of love as the union between two things. Because the tower that he drew up originally came from his notebooks as a bridge whose center was gradually pulled up to a high point. Now, pulling both ends together and bringing those ends closer in this way, his tower could now hold up not just people, but ideals as well. And so he gave us this permanent symbol both of technical progress and of the city of love itself. You see, I think noble ideas do pull people together. And the story I'm about to share with you puts love at the center and at the top throughout. I don't see any problem with bringing a story in that way. And that kind of narrative is a dual narrative. And I think it's richer and more beautiful because it brings us not only to human affairs, but to something that was really wonderful and an effort of great dedication and wisdom in the form of this extraordinary architectural symbol. So that's all I wanted to share with you today. Maybe we can see that kind of work in more than just anthropocentric narratives.